When I returned from vacation, my ranch was missing its oldest tree. HOA called it ugly, but they had no idea they had destroyed a priceless piece of history worth $1 million. Welcome back, everyone. Before today's story begins, I want to thank each and every one of you for being here. If this is your first time on the channel, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you'll always know when a new story is released. Your support means more than you know. Every like, comment, and subscription helps this channel grow and allows us to keep sharing incredible stories with viewers around the world. And before we begin, tell me this: where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. Now, grab a comfortable seat, relax, and let's dive into today's unforgettable story. The first thing I noticed when I drove back onto my ranch wasn't what I saw. It was what I didn't see. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and I still remember the silence that greeted me after a week away. The open fields were exactly as I left them. The fence lines were untouched. The old barn stood beneath the afternoon sky. But something was missing. Something that had been there longer than any building on my property. The old oak tree at the edge of the pasture was gone. For generations, that tree had stood as a landmark on my ranch. It was the first thing my grandfather showed me when I was a child. Its branches stretched across the land like they were protecting everything beneath them. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't young. But it was part of this place. And now, there was only an empty patch of dirt, scattered branches, and the smell of freshly cut wood hanging in the air. I stepped out of my truck slowly, almost expecting someone to tell me there was a mistake. Maybe a storm had damaged it. Maybe a dangerous branch had fallen. Maybe there was some explanation that made sense. Then I saw the tire tracks. Heavy equipment tracks leading straight across my property. Near the remaining stump, pieces of wood were still scattered across the ground. Someone hadn't removed a fallen tree. Someone had cut it down. While I was gone, I walked closer and placed my hand on the rough surface of the stump. The tree that had been there for over a century was reduced to a memory in less than a day. That was when I noticed the small sign attached near the property entrance. Silver Creek Estates HOA. My stomach tightened. Before I could even make the call, a white SUV pulled onto the gravel road. Victoria Harrington stepped out wearing a perfectly arranged business outfit, holding a folder under her arm. She looked calm. Too calm. "Ethan," she said, walking toward me. "I assume you've seen the improvement." Improvement. That word immediately told me everything I needed to know. "You cut down my tree," I said. Victoria glanced toward the empty space where the oak once stood. It was becoming an eyesore. The HOA received several complaints about its appearance. I looked at the stump again. It was on my ranch. She smiled slightly, as if that detail was only a small technicality. We were improving the overall appearance of the area. The community benefits from maintaining certain standards. I had heard similar language before. Rules. Standards. Community image. Words that sounded reasonable until they were used to justify something nobody had the right to do. I asked the question I already knew mattered. "Who gave you permission?" For the first time, Victoria paused. Only for a second. But I noticed. "The HOA board approved the action," she replied. "That's not what I asked," I said. "Who gave you permission to enter my property and remove something that belonged to me?" The confidence in her expression changed slightly. Not much, but enough. She looked at the stump, then back at me. "Ethan, I think you're overreacting." Overreacting. That was when I realized she didn't see a problem. She saw an inconvenience. To her, the tree was just an old object that didn't match her vision of the neighborhood. To me, it was history. It was a piece of my family's story. And standing there in the fading sunlight, looking at the empty space where that tree had stood for over 150 years, I knew one thing. Victoria Harrington had no idea what she had destroyed. She thought she removed an ugly old tree. She had no idea she had just created the most expensive mistake of her life. People think a tree is just wood, leaves, and branches. They don't understand that some trees carry memories that cannot be replaced. That was the thought I kept repeating to myself after Victoria Harrington drove away from my ranch. I stood there beside the empty space where the old oak had stood for more than a century, trying to process how quickly something so important could disappear. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and that tree was never just part of the landscape. It was part of my family's story. Long before Silver Creek Estates existed, long before HOA rules and neighborhood meetings, that tree was already standing on this land. My grandfather used to bring me there when I was a kid. He would sit beneath those branches and tell me stories about the ranch, about hard years, good years, and the responsibility that came with owning land. He always told me something I never forgot. You don't truly own a piece of land unless you understand what came before you. That old oak was a connection between generations. When I inherited the ranch, I made a promise that I would protect it, not because it was perfect, but because it mattered. Over the years, I watched storms hit it, watched seasons change around it, and watched new buildings appear in the distance while it remained exactly where it belonged. That was why Victoria's explanation bothered me so much. She didn't see a history. She saw a problem. She saw something old and decided it needed to disappear. The next morning, I began searching through every document connected to the incident. I wanted to know exactly how the HOA believed they had the authority to enter my ranch and remove my tree. I reviewed property records, HOA guidelines, and any communication related to landscaping decisions. The more I looked, the more questions appeared. Silver Creek Estates had rules about maintaining appearances, but those rules were written for shared community spaces. They did not give the HOA control over private ranch property. That distinction mattered. A neighborhood association can create standards within its boundaries. It cannot simply decide that someone else's property needs to change because they dislike how it looks. I contacted the HOA office and requested the paperwork behind the decision. A few days later, I received a response from Victoria. Her message was polite, but the confidence behind the words was obvious. She explained that the HOA acted in the community's best interest and believed the tree lowered the area's visual appeal. Visual appeal. That phrase stayed in my mind. Because to Victoria, the tree was an inconvenience. To me, it was something irreplaceable. I printed her response and placed it beside the property documents. The difference was clear. She was talking about appearance. I was talking about ownership. That was when I realized this was bigger than a disagreement about a tree. It was about whether someone could look at another person's property and decide they knew better. Later that week, I walked back to the empty spot where the oak once stood. The sunset stretched across the ranch, and for a moment, I imagined the tree still there, its branches moving in the wind like they always had. Then I looked down at the stump again. Someone had removed something they never understood, but they also left behind something they never expected. Evidence. And I was about to find out exactly how expensive that mistake would become. The easiest way to lose a battle is to fight without knowing the rules. The easiest way to win is to understand every rule better than the person who used them against you. That was exactly what I needed to do after Victoria Harrington removed my tree and tried to justify it with HOA authority. I wasn't interested in arguing with her. I wasn't interested in creating a scene. I needed facts. Facts were the only thing that mattered. I spent the following days going through every document connected to my ranch and Silver Creek Estates. I reviewed the HOA guidelines, property records, and every notice I could find about landscaping decisions. I wanted to understand one thing. How did Victoria believe she had the right to make a decision about something that was not hers? The answer became clearer with every page I read. The HOA had rules about maintaining the appearance of shared areas. They had guidelines for common spaces, community entrances, and neighborhood landscaping. But my ranch was not a common area. The old oak tree stood on private property. My property. That simple fact changed everything. Victoria had taken a rule designed to manage community spaces and stretched it into something it was never meant to be. She had turned a neighborhood guideline into permission to control someone else's land. I called the HOA office and requested the official records related to the tree removal. At first, the response was slow. Days passed before I received anything. When the documents finally arrived, I noticed something immediately. There was no signed permission from me. No property access agreement. No written approval from my side. The decision had been made entirely inside the HOA. They had discussed my tree as if it belonged to them. That bothered me more than the removal itself. A mistake could happen. A misunderstanding could happen. But treating another person's property like a community asset was something completely different. I printed every document and placed them across my dining table. The empty space outside my window reminded me why I was doing this. It wasn't only about an oak tree. It was about a line that should never have been crossed. A few days later, I met with a property attorney who reviewed the information. He looked carefully through the records before asking me one question. Did anyone from the HOA ever contact you before the removal? I shook my head. No. He looked back at the paperwork. Then the first issue is not the value of the tree. The first issue is authority. That word stayed with me. Authority. Victoria had acted like the position of HOA president gave her the power to make decisions over anything she considered a problem. But authority has limits. Rules have limits. Even organizations with power have boundaries they cannot cross. After the meeting, I drove back to the ranch and walked toward the empty space where the oak once stood. The evening wind moved across the field, but something felt different. Before, I was looking at a loss. Now, I was looking at evidence. The stump was not just a reminder of what had been taken. It was proof that someone had made a decision without understanding what they were destroying. I started making a list of everything that needed to be investigated next. The tree's history, its actual value, the removal process, the people involved. Because I had a feeling Victoria Harrington had made the same mistake many people make when they believe they are in control. She only looked at what was visible. She never looked deeper. And somewhere beneath the surface of that old tree was the truth she never expected to find. Sometimes the biggest secrets are not hidden in what remains. They are hidden in what someone tried to erase. That was exactly what I discovered when I started investigating the history of the old oak tree. Victoria Harrington thought removing it would end the conversation. She believed once the tree was gone, nobody could question the decision anymore. But she made one mistake. She removed the evidence that could have revealed the truth, but she couldn't remove the records behind it. I began researching everything connected to the tree. I contacted local agricultural experts, reviewed historical property information, and searched through documents related to the ranch. At first, I was simply trying to understand what had been destroyed. I expected to find that the tree had sentimental value. I expected to confirm what I already knew. But I wasn't prepared for what I discovered. The oak was not just an old tree sitting on unused land. It was a rare specimen that had been documented by conservation specialists years earlier. Its age, size, and condition made it extremely valuable. I stared at the report for several minutes, reading the same information again and again. The tree Victoria called ugly had a history that stretched back more than a century. It had survived storms, droughts, and decades of change. It was not damaged. It was not dangerous. It was not a threat to anyone. It was simply old. And somehow, that was enough for Victoria to decide it needed to disappear. The valuation report contained the number that changed everything. The estimated replacement and conservation value of the tree was close to $1 million. $1 million. I remember sitting there in my office, looking at that number and thinking about Victoria's words. It was becoming an eyesore. She had reduced something priceless to a matter of appearance. She had judged it by what she saw on the surface and never bothered to understand what existed underneath. I immediately started comparing the valuation information with the HOA records. The timeline became even more concerning. Victoria and the HOA board approved the removal without requesting a professional assessment. They never consulted an arborist. They never reviewed the tree's history. They never asked whether the property owner had any objections. They simply decided. That was the part that bothered me most. The money mattered, but the decision-making process mattered even more. A person can make a mistake, but when someone has authority and refuses to verify the facts before taking action, that mistake becomes something much bigger. I contacted Victoria again and asked for a formal explanation of the removal process. Her response was different this time. The confidence was still there, but the certainty was fading. She said the HOA believed they acted appropriately and that the tree's value was unexpected. Unexpected. That word told me everything. They weren't denying what happened. They were admitting they never bothered to find out. I looked out across the ranch that evening. The empty space where the oak once stood felt different now. Before, it represented loss. Now, it represented something else. It represented the truth that Victoria never wanted to uncover. She thought she had removed a problem from my land. Instead, she had revealed the cost of ignoring someone else's property rights. And the more I learned, the more I realized this was no longer just about a tree. It was about accountability. Because a $1 million mistake does not happen because someone knows too much. It happens because someone assumes they know everything. The moment someone realizes they made a mistake is often the moment they start looking for someone else to blame. That was exactly what happened when Victoria Harrington discovered the old oak tree was worth far more than she ever imagined. The confidence she had shown when she stood beside my ranch disappeared the moment the facts started coming out. But instead of accepting responsibility, she tried to protect the decision she had already made. I watched the situation change from a simple property dispute into something much bigger. The HOA was no longer defending a landscaping choice. They were defending a decision that could cost them everything. After receiving the valuation report, I organized all the information I had collected: the tree assessment, the property documents, the HOA communications, the timeline of what happened while I was away. Every piece connected to the same conclusion. The tree was removed without proper authorization, and the people responsible never understood what they were destroying. I requested a formal meeting with the HOA board. I wanted everyone involved to see the same information I had discovered. I didn't want rumors. I didn't want emotional arguments. I wanted the facts sitting on the table where nobody could ignore them. When I arrived at the HOA office, Victoria was already there. She looked different from the first day I met her. Before, she carried herself like someone who believed the conversation was already finished. Now, there was hesitation behind her expression. The board members sat quietly as I placed the documents in front of them. "This is not just about a tree," I said. "This is about a decision made on property that does not belong to the HOA." Victoria immediately responded. The HOA acted based on concerns from residents. The tree affected the appearance of the area. I looked at her and asked, "Did anyone order a professional evaluation before removing it?" The room became silent. Nobody answered. That silence was the answer. They had made a decision about something they never truly understood. I explained the tree's history. I explained the assessment. I explained that the value came from more than the wood itself. It came from age, rarity, conservation significance, and the fact that something like this could never simply be replaced. One of the board members looked through the report carefully and then asked Victoria, "Why wasn't this reviewed before approval?" Victoria looked down at the papers. For the first time, she didn't have a quick explanation. She had spent so much time focusing on how the tree looked that she never considered what the tree was worth. After the meeting, I returned to my ranch and stood near the empty space again. The anger I felt in the beginning had changed. I still wished the tree was standing there. I still believed it should have been protected. But now I understood something important. The mistake was bigger than one person making a bad choice. It was a system where people trusted authority without checking the facts. Over the next several days, the HOA began receiving more questions from residents. People wanted to know why they were never informed about the full details. They wanted to know why one person had the ability to approve such a major action without proper investigation. Victoria had built her reputation around the idea that she protected the community. But now the community was asking whether she had protected them at all. She thought removing the tree would make the ranch look better. She never realized that losing that tree would expose everything hidden behind the HOA's decisions. And the more people learned, the clearer the truth became. This was never about an ugly old tree. It was about what happens when someone mistakes authority for ownership. The moment someone realizes they can no longer control the story is the moment they start trying to control the damage. That was exactly what happened with Victoria Harrington. For weeks, she had been the person explaining everything. She decided what information mattered. She decided what the neighborhood needed to know. But once the facts about my old oak tree became public, that control began slipping away. The HOA was no longer dealing with a homeowner who was asking questions. They were dealing with a situation where every answer created more questions. I continued gathering information, not because I wanted to punish anyone, but because I wanted a complete record of what happened. I requested additional documents from the HOA, including meeting notes, approval records, and communications between board members. What I found confirmed something important. The decision to remove the tree was not accidental. It was discussed. It was approved. And it was done without anyone stopping to ask whether they had the right to do it. That detail changed everything. A mistake made by one person could be explained. But a group of people approving something without verifying ownership was a much larger problem. I met with my attorney again and reviewed the next steps. He explained that the strongest part of my case was not only the financial loss. It was the lack of authorization. The value of the tree made the situation serious, but the violation of property rights was what made it impossible to ignore. I looked back at the photos I had taken before leaving for vacation. The old oak stood tall in every image. It looked exactly as it had for years. Healthy, strong, part of the ranch. Those photos became more important than I ever expected. They showed what existed before the HOA decided to change my property without permission. A few days later, Victoria contacted me again. Her message sounded more careful than before. She no longer described the removal as a simple improvement. Instead, she suggested that the HOA wanted to find a reasonable resolution. I read the message and thought about the first conversation we had. Back then, she told me I was overreacting. She acted like the tree was an inconvenience and the situation was already settled. Now, she was looking for a way forward. I agreed to meet, but I made one thing clear. Any discussion had to begin with honesty about what happened. When we met, Victoria brought several board members with her. The atmosphere was different from the first time. There was no confidence that the matter would simply disappear. I placed the documents on the table one by one. The property records, the tree assessment, the approval timeline. The evidence showed the same thing from every angle. The HOA made a decision about something they did not understand. Victoria looked through the papers quietly. "We didn't know the tree had that kind of value," she finally said. I looked at her and replied, "That was the problem. You never checked before you removed it." Nobody spoke after that. Because the truth was simple. The tree's value was important, but the lesson was bigger. You cannot make decisions about someone else's property based only on what you see from the outside. Victoria saw an old tree. She saw something outdated. She saw something she wanted gone. She never saw the history beneath the bark, the years it represented, or the responsibility that came with owning land. And now the HOA had to face the consequence of that mistake. The tree was gone, but the evidence they left behind was still standing. There is a difference between losing something valuable and allowing someone to believe they can take anything they want. That was the thought that guided me as I prepared the next step. The old oak tree was gone, but I refused to let its disappearance become just another forgotten HOA decision. Victoria Harrington expected the situation to end with an apology or a small settlement. She thought the community would move on, but she underestimated one thing. I was not fighting because I wanted money. I was fighting because I wanted accountability. After reviewing all the evidence, my attorney recommended moving forward with a formal claim against the HOA. The case was not built around emotion. It was built around facts. We had the property records showing the tree belonged to my ranch. We had the HOA documents showing they approved the removal. We had the expert assessment showing the value they never bothered to investigate. Every piece connected together like a puzzle that Victoria never expected anyone to complete. When the legal process began, the HOA changed its approach. The confident statements about community improvement became much quieter. Their messages became more careful. Their explanations became less certain. Suddenly, the same people who acted like the decision was obvious were now looking for ways to explain why it happened. I noticed the difference immediately. Before, they believed they were defending a decision. Now, they were defending a mistake. The most important moment came when the HOA requested another meeting before the matter moved further. Victoria arrived with several board members, but the energy in the room had completely changed. She no longer spoke like someone giving instructions. She spoke like someone trying to limit the damage. "Ethan, we understand this situation has become more complicated than expected," she said. I looked at the documents in front of me. Complicated was an interesting word. From my perspective, the situation had always been simple. Someone entered my property and removed something they did not own. The only complicated part was explaining why they thought they had the right to do it. I asked Victoria one question. If the tree had no value, would the HOA still have had permission to remove it? She paused. The room became quiet. Because that was the real issue. The $1 million value made people pay attention, but ownership was the foundation of everything. A less valuable tree would still have been my tree. A less expensive mistake would still have been a violation. That was when some of the board members began to understand what had happened. This was not just about replacing a tree. You cannot simply plant another one and pretend history returns. The old oak had existed longer than the HOA itself. It carried memories that could not be recreated. A few weeks later, the community began asking more questions. Residents who once accepted Victoria's decisions without hesitation started requesting records and explanations. They wanted to know how one person's judgment could lead to such a costly mistake. Victoria had spent years presenting herself as the person protecting property values. But now people were questioning whether her choices had actually put those values at risk. I returned to the ranch that evening and stood beside the empty space where the oak once grew. The loss was still there. I still wished the tree was standing. But I also knew something important had changed. The HOA had removed the tree, but they had planted something else in its place. Accountability. And that was something even Victoria Harrington could not cut down. The truth does not always arrive with a dramatic moment. Sometimes it arrives slowly, as people begin asking the questions they should have asked from the beginning. That was exactly what happened inside Silver Creek Estates. For the first time since Victoria Harrington became HOA president, people were no longer accepting every decision without looking deeper. The old oak tree had changed everything. It revealed that confidence and authority were not the same thing. After the legal process moved forward, more residents started requesting information about the HOA's decisions. They wanted to understand how a tree on private property could be removed without the owner's approval. They wanted to know why nobody checked the facts before taking action. Those questions created pressure that Victoria had never experienced before. She was used to being the person with answers. But now, she was the person being asked for them. The final community meeting took place several weeks later. I arrived early and watched residents enter the room. The atmosphere felt completely different from the first HOA meeting I attended. Before, people listened because they trusted Victoria. This time, they listened because they wanted the truth. Victoria stood at the front of the room with a folder in her hands. She still looked professional and composed, but the confidence she carried before was gone. The board members sat beside her quietly. They knew the situation had changed. When the meeting began, Victoria tried to explain that the HOA had always acted with the intention of protecting neighborhood standards. She talked about appearances, property values, and community expectations. But this time, people asked different questions. Did you verify ownership before approving the removal? One resident asked. Another followed with, did anyone request an expert evaluation? Victoria paused before answering. The silence said more than any explanation could. I sat there listening, remembering the first day I found the empty space where the oak tree had stood. Back then, I felt like something had been taken from me. Now, I realized something else had happened. The truth had been uncovered. I stood up when it was my turn to speak. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't attack Victoria. I simply explained what happened. The tree belonged to my property. The HOA made a decision without permission. The value was never investigated before removal. The facts were simple. The mistake was not caused by a lack of information. It was caused by people believing they already knew enough. After the meeting, several residents approached me. Some apologized for assuming the HOA had handled everything correctly. Others admitted they had never considered questioning the decision because Victoria always appeared certain. I understood why they felt that way. People often trust confidence because it feels like knowledge. But confidence without verification can create serious consequences. Over the following weeks, the HOA reached a resolution regarding the damages. The financial consequences reflected the seriousness of the mistake. But for me, the most important outcome was not the money. It was the acknowledgement that what happened was wrong. The old oak tree could never return. No payment could recreate the years it stood on my ranch. But the lesson remained. Property rights are not protected by popularity. They are protected by respect. Victoria thought she was removing an ugly old tree. She never realized that the tree would reveal the biggest weakness in her leadership. She removed something valuable from my land. But in doing so, she exposed something far more important. The truth. Some things can be replaced with money. Some things can be repaired with time. But some things, once taken away, can only leave behind a lesson. That is what I think about whenever I look across my ranch today. The old oak tree is no longer standing there. The empty space remains a reminder of what happened. But the story that grew from that loss became something much bigger than one tree. It became a reminder that ownership means something. Respect means something. And nobody, no matter how much authority they believe they have, should be able to decide the value of someone else's property. After everything was resolved with Silver Creek Estates, life on the ranch slowly returned to normal. The fields looked the same. The quiet mornings returned. The wind moved through the land just as it always had. But there was one difference. The people around me understood the importance of asking questions before accepting decisions made by others. Victoria Harrington lost more than a legal dispute. She lost the trust she spent years building. The HOA eventually changed how major property-related decisions were reviewed. New procedures were created to ensure that situations like mine would not happen again. Before any action involving private property could move forward, documentation and approval had to be carefully verified. For me, that was the most important outcome. Not the financial settlement, not the public attention. The fact that a mistake led to a change that protected other homeowners mattered more. I still remember the first day I returned from vacation. I remember stepping out of my truck, smelling the fresh-cut wood, and seeing the empty space where my oak tree had stood for generations. At that moment, I felt like something had been taken from me that I could never recover. And I was right. The tree would never grow back. The memories connected to it could never be recreated. But I also learned something. Losing something valuable does not mean the story ends there. Sometimes, the thing someone takes from you becomes the reason the truth finally comes out. Victoria thought the old oak was an eyesore. She looked at its age and saw a problem. She looked at its appearance and decided it had no place on my ranch. But she never looked deeper. She never saw the history beneath the branches. She never understood the connection between the land and the people who cared for it. Most importantly, she never considered that the decision she made without permission would reveal the limits of her own power. Today, when I walk across my ranch, I still pass the place where the oak once stood. Sometimes I stop there and remember my grandfather sitting beneath those branches, sharing stories about this land. I think about how quickly someone can destroy something they do not understand. But I also think about how powerful the truth can become when someone takes the time to uncover it. The HOA believed they were removing an ugly old tree. They believed they were protecting their vision of the community. Instead, they created the biggest mistake in their history and exposed the danger of unchecked authority. That tree may be gone, but its final lesson remains. Property is not just about what can be seen. It is about history, responsibility, and respect. And justice does not always come from making the loudest argument. Sometimes it comes from standing quietly, gathering the facts, and refusing to let anyone rewrite what is right. Because in the end, the tree was not the only thing that mattered. The truth did too.